Have you ever felt a strange shiver in your chest? The kind that whispers, something is wrong, but you're too afraid to say it out loud? Have you ever smiled just to keep the peace, even when your soul was screaming the opposite? Let me ask you one more unsettling question. What happens when a person who feels everything finally stops pretending? My name is Carl Jung, and today I'll tell you something most people never dare to confront. The most terrifying moment in an empath's life is not when they feel too much, but when they stop lying to themselves. Because when an empath chooses truth over pleasing others, something extraordinary and dangerous awakens inside them. You see, all your life you've been trained to soften your voice, to edit your feelings, to translate pain into politeness. Society celebrates you for being kind, understanding, easygoing. But deep inside, you know the truth. You weren't being kind. You were being afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of disappointing someone, even if they were quietly destroying you. I once said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But an empath rarely gets that privilege, because they're too busy becoming what everyone else needs. Until one day, something shifts, something breaks, or better, something awakens. Let me show you how it happens. It usually begins with a moment that looks ordinary, yet feels massive. Maybe someone crossed a boundary you thought they'd never cross. Maybe you realized you were apologizing for things that were never your fault. Maybe you caught yourself saying, "I'm fine," when every part of you was exhausted, unseen, unheard. And suddenly, silence becomes unbearable. People-pleasing becomes suffocating. Your own truth, once quiet, soft, obedient, starts pounding inside your chest like a wild heartbeat refusing to be ignored. The empath begins to grow a spine. And trust me, when an empath grows a spine, the world trembles. Because an empath with boundaries, an empath who speaks honestly, an empath who chooses truth, no matter the cost, is the most powerful psychological force in any room. They can no longer be manipulated by guilt, no longer controlled by fear, no longer shaped by the emotional demands of others. For the first time, they stop asking, "What does this person need from me?" And they begin asking, "What do I need from myself?" This shift is not gentle. It is not pretty. It is not peaceful. It is a psychological earthquake. People around them feel it. The ones who benefited from the empath's silence suddenly feel threatened. They accuse them of being selfish, distant, changed. They say, "You're not the same person anymore." But the truth is, you're not becoming someone else. You're returning to who you were before the world taught you to shrink. Here's the secret no one tells you. Empaths don't lose people when they choose truth. They lose illusions. They lose emotional parasites. They lose people who love the mask, not the soul behind it. And once this awakening begins, an empath discovers a rare kind of inner fire, something I spent my life studying, the individuated self. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about accepting your own thoughts, your own voice, your own emotional reality, without apologizing for existing. When an empath stops pleasing others and starts honoring their truth, they no longer live in emotional debt. They no longer trade silence for acceptance. They no longer sacrifice themselves to protect the fragile egos around them. They evolve. But here's the twist. The transformation is not the end. It is the beginning of a much deeper journey, one where the empath must face their shadow, confront the unconscious patterns that kept them silent, and rebuild their identity from the inside. And that is where the real story begins. Before we move forward, I want you to pause and breathe. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just psychology. It is a mirror, one most people are terrified to look into. Let me ask you something unsettling. What if the very emotions you thought made you good were the same emotions that kept you enslaved? When an empath chooses truth over pleasing, something deep inside them begins to stir. Not light, not comfort, but the shadow. And yes, this is the same shadow I've spent decades studying. The silent twin, the hidden self. The version of you that holds everything you suppress: anger, resentment, desires, instincts, unspoken thoughts, abandoned dreams. Empaths think they are soft creatures made only of warmth and compassion. But the truth is far more thrilling, far more uncomfortable. No one has a darker shadow than someone who has spent their whole life pretending to be light. For years, the empath absorbs emotions like a sponge. Others' pain, others' guilt, others' trauma. They swallow their own feelings to maintain harmony. But swallowed emotions never disappear. They simply sink into the shadow, waiting, growing, intensifying. And the moment the empath stops pleasing others, the shadow finally opens its eyes. You begin to notice things you never allowed yourself to see. You see how often you said yes when every part of you meant no. You see how you protected people who wouldn't protect you. You see how you abandoned your needs to keep someone else comfortable. It is a shocking realization. You weren't being loving. You were being afraid of being unloved. This is the moment where most empaths panic. They think something has gone wrong. But actually, this is the first time in their entire life something has gone right. Because healing never begins with light. Healing begins with honesty. And honesty begins with the shadow. Let me give you an example from the human psyche I often explained. Imagine a person who never expresses anger. Everyone praises them. Such a calm person, they say. Never complains, so patient. But this person isn't calm. They're suppressing. And suppressed anger becomes resentment. Resentment becomes bitterness. Bitterness becomes self-betrayal. The shadow grows silently, feeding on everything you refuse to face. Until one day, you stop pretending. You finally look into the mirror of your own emotions and whisper, "I'm tired." This whisper is the beginning of your rebellion. Because when an empath acknowledges their shadow, when they stop apologizing for having needs, stop shrinking their opinions, stop accepting disrespect, they begin to heal the deepest wound of all, the wound of emotional self-abandonment. At this stage, something extraordinary happens. Your intuition sharpens, your boundaries strengthen, your tolerance for manipulation drops dramatically. You stop over-explaining. You stop fixing people who enjoy being broken. You stop fighting for relationships where you are the only one bleeding. The world begins to call this ego. But it's not ego. It's recovery. See, the shadow is not your enemy. It is your unexpressed power, your unspoken truth, your suppressed fire. When you integrate your shadow, you don't become cruel. You become complete. You no longer fear conflict because you no longer fear yourself. You no longer say, "It's okay," when it's not. You no longer carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. You finally understand one of my most important insights. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is the moment when the empath stops being a gentle mirror for others and becomes a clear window into themselves. But this journey isn't over. What comes next is even more powerful. The stage where the empath rebuilds identity, not from fear, not from people-pleasing, but from authentic truth. And when an empath stands in their truth, the world responds in a way they never expect. Have you ever wondered what happens when an empath finally steps out of the role the world forced upon them? When they stop being the healer, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the emotional shock absorber? What happens when they choose truth, even when that truth shakes every relationship around them? Let me take you into that moment. It feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward, and everything you once knew, every dynamic, every bond, every expectation, begins to melt away. But in that terrifying silence, an extraordinary rebirth begins. Because the moment the empath stops living through others, they encounter something they have never truly met before: their own identity. For years, the empath's identity was shaped like clay in other people's hands. Be nice. Stay quiet. Don't upset anyone. Hold everything together. Be available. Be soft. Be understanding. A lifetime of emotional instructions. And then one day, you break the pattern. Not out of anger, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. You finally understand that pleasing others is not compassion. It is self-erasure. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. Because now, for the first time, you must ask the question you avoided your entire life. If I stop pleasing, who am I? This question is the heart of the empath's awakening. It forces you into the deepest room in your psyche, the room where you meet your authentic self. When you enter this room, three things begin to happen. 1. Your energy stops leaking. You stop giving emotional CPR to relationships that were already flat-lined. You stop rescuing people who drown by choice. You stop offering loyalty where you receive convenience. And suddenly, your energy returns to you. You feel clearer, more grounded, more alive. This is not personality change. This is personality reclamation. 2. Your intuition sharpens like a blade. For years, your intuition whispered, but you were too busy silencing yourself to hear it. Now it speaks loudly. This person is draining you. That situation is wrong for you. You're betraying yourself again. You become impossible to manipulate, not because you are colder, but because you are finally conscious. Awareness becomes your armor. 3. You begin to set boundaries without guilt. This is where people around you become confused, even threatened. They say you've changed. They say you've become selfish. They say you're not the same person anymore. But what they really mean is, you've stopped living for us. Boundaries reveal which relationships were based on love, and which were based on your silence. This is the stage where many relationships fall away, not because you pushed them, but because they depended on your inability to say no. And when you finally say no, the illusion collapses. Let me share one of my most powerful psychological truths. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And this privilege begins the moment the empath chooses truth over comfort. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You stop shrinking your voice. You stop carrying emotional debt that isn't yours. You stop performing kindness and start practicing authenticity. Your soul begins to breathe again. This shift radiates into every part of your life, your work, your relationships, your creativity, your decisions, your emotional world. People who once depended on your compliance begin to step back. New people, those who value your truth, step forward. You attract differently because you express differently. But the most powerful transformation is internal. You start enjoying your own company. You start trusting your own judgment. You start choosing yourself, not as a last option, but as a first truth. You finally understand that choosing truth is not losing kindness. It is losing the fear that kept your kindness chained. This stage marks the empath's rebirth, not a softer version, not a harsher version, but a real version. Someone who sees themselves clearly, stands firmly, speaks honestly, and loves consciously. But there's one more stage left. The final transformation, the moment the empath steps fully into their truth and becomes unshakable. There comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible to the outside world, when an empath who has chosen truth over pleasing reaches the final stage of transformation. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's not a breakdown or an explosion. It is a calm certainty, a knowing, a grounded, powerful stillness inside the self. This is the moment you no longer explain your truth. You embody it. People feel the shift before they understand it. Your presence becomes different, lighter but stronger, softer but clearer, kinder but no longer bending. Because now you are no longer an empath who absorbs everything. You are an empath who chooses. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And this is the stage where the empath finally becomes the director, not the victim, of their story. Let me take you into what this final transformation looks like from the inside. 1. You no longer fear disappointing others. This is the most powerful shift. You realize that disappointment is not a tragedy. It is simply the truth doing its job. You stop sacrificing your emotional health so others can remain comfortable. You stop offering yes where your soul screams no. You stop tying your worth to how well you can adjust yourself to someone else's needs. Instead, you begin to understand a deeper psychological truth. People's reactions are not your responsibility. Your authenticity is. 2. You attract relationships that respect your reality. When your energy changes, your relationships reorganize. Those who needed you weak fade away. Those who respected your strength move closer. You begin to experience a different kind of connection, one built not on emotional labor, but on emotional honesty. Suddenly, you're surrounded by people who don't panic when you have boundaries. People who don't guilt-trip you when you choose yourself. People who don't demand more than your spirit can give. You start to feel something new. Reciprocity. And for an empath, reciprocity feels like oxygen. 3. You become impossible to manipulate. When you lived to please, people sensed it. Consciously or unconsciously, some used it. But now, your intuition, your boundaries, and your self-awareness form a shield. You see through disguised guilt. You recognize emotional traps. You understand your triggers. You sense hidden intentions. You no longer walk into situations blind. Your inner light is on now, bright, focused, and discerning. This is when you truly understand Jung's wisdom. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Because once you can see yourself clearly, no one can distort your reality again. 4. You become your own safe place. The empath's deepest wound has always been the fear of abandonment. But once truth becomes your compass, something incredible happens. You stop abandoning yourself. You don't run from your feelings anymore. You don't silence your intuition anymore. You don't negotiate your worth anymore. You become the friend you always searched for, the protector you never had, the guide you always needed. You understand finally, profoundly, powerfully, that choosing truth was not the end of your softness. It was the beginning of your self-respect. And now, I want to speak directly to every empath listening. If you've ever been told you're too emotional, too sensitive, too caring, too much. Remember this. You were never too much. You were simply giving your depth to people who lived on the surface. Now, live for your truth. Not for approval, not for validation, not for peacekeeping, but for the quiet strength of knowing who you are. If this message touched your heart, if it made you feel seen, understood, or less alone, then I want to ask you something from a place of sincerity, not performance. Support this voice, support this space, because every like, every share, every subscribe is not just a click. It is a signal that there are others like you, silent healers searching for strength, gentle souls learning to stand tall, empaths finally choosing truth over pleasing. And together, we create a world where sensitivity is not a weakness, it is wisdom.